Good evening, everyone. My name is Kristina Williams, and I am the Executive Director of the Charles Village Community Benefits District, and will be your moderator for this session on employment and small business. Small businesses are the heartbeat of any local's economy, and here in Baltimore is no different. I am very excited for this panel discussion and hope that you are as well. Our panelists will discuss many topics as they relate to small business and employment, reviewing data on availability and access to capital, debut a new data economic tool, and discuss the impact of COVID on small businesses, as well as make recommendations for how to support small businesses in their vital role in the economy. Also, as a reminder to those who have been participating in Data Day for the last 2 days, and just a point of order for those, if this is your first session that you're joining this week, please place all your questions in the chat, or feel free to send them to everyone, and feel free to send them to everyone, or you can send them to just the panelists as well. Okay, so this evening we are joined by some of our city's most brilliant minds, and we're going to begin with Ajjit Narayanan. Ajjit is a data science analyst at the Urban Institute, where he works with researchers to improve access to data, analytic tools, and innovative research methods. Ajjit?
Awesome. Let me go ahead and share my screen and start a very short PowerPoint. Oops, let's start. There we go. Awesome. Can people see my screen? Awesome. So my name is Ajjit Narayanan, and I'm a data science analyst at the Urban Institute. For those of you that are unfamiliar, the Urban Institute is a nonprofit research organization that tries to better the lives of people and places in the United States. And we do a lot of specifically social and economic policy research and working with municipal and state policymakers to push policy changes. So what I'm going to be talking to you guys today about is Urban's low-income job loss tool. This tool was created in the immediate aftermath of COVID-19 to try to give both policymakers, community residents, and nonprofit practitioners data on where people were losing their jobs and where help and support were most needed. So just a little bit of background. Why did we build this tool? First, we specifically wanted to help lots of government agencies, nonprofits, and service providers best target their COVID-19 support and aid. In the immediate aftermath of when COVID-19 struck, lots of communities were facing hardship, and lots of nonprofits and community organizations wanted to provide help, but they often asked organizations like us to help them target exactly which neighborhoods and parts of the cities they should help. So we try to build a super specific tool that can drill down to the neighborhood level and tell you how neighborhoods are faring. We also knew that workers in certain industries are more likely to become unemployed due to COVID-19, particularly workers in service industries, which were the first to lay folks off. But many nonprofits and government agencies wanted to know, where do those workers live? And that way, how can we best allocate resources and aid towards them? So on the right is a picture of what the tool currently looks like. And I'm actually going to be spending most of this time doing a live demo of this tool to show you what you can learn about your neighborhood and what you can learn about really all neighborhoods in the United States. So with that being said, we're going to skip to the live demo section of this. And for this section, I'm going to assume that if you want to follow along with me at home, you can. So I'm just going to go really slowly, talk step by step, starting with how to get to the tool. So if you just open up a Google Chrome tab and search for something along the lines of urban low-income job loss, and you Google that, we should be one of the first results. And the particular website title is called Where Low-Income Jobs Are Being Lost to COVID-19. So if you click that, it should bring up a title like this. And if you scroll down a little bit, there's an abbreviated version of the PowerPoint I just gave that talks about why we built the tool. And then a map down here at the bottom with 2 tabs. One tab for county and one tab for metro area. So you can kind of zoom into this map based on the county that you want to, or you can zoom into this map based on the larger metro area you're a part of. For now, I'm going to keep it on county, and I'm going to scroll down. So when you first see this map, you're going to see a map of the entire United States, and you're going to get some helpful numbers. So here it says that the total estimated low-income jobs lost in the United States is about 9 million. Now, what that means, breaking it down, is since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in early March, approximately 9 million low-income jobs, that is, jobs making less than $40,000 a year, have been lost across the United States. And that's like a net job loss number. So that takes into account both jobs that were lost after the pandemic and jobs that were gained. And when we initially started this, we actually published this specific data tool in late April. This number was actually much closer to 15 million. But as time went on and some states started to reopen and some jobs were gained back, this number has slowly been creeping a little bit downwards. And so now we're at 9 million net total jobs lost since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the right here, you can also get a breakdown of those 9 million jobs, how they break down by industry. And specifically, we can see that the accommodation and food service industry was hit very, very hard. And so there are over 3 million jobs lost, and they account for almost a third of the total low-income jobs lost. Similarly, some other very heavily hit sectors were healthcare and social assistance and retail trade. And so I want to take one small step back and say, I haven't actually mentioned anything about small businesses yet, and that's the focus of this panel. But while this tool itself is focused specifically on low-income workers, I will say, and a lot of the panelists later will be talking about this, many of Baltimore small businesses fall into some of these hardest hit categories, including accommodation and food services, healthcare and social assistance, and retail trade. So while this map doesn't exactly map to where small businesses are losing jobs, it's a pretty good proxy. And the hardest hit industries here are also the main industries that Baltimore small businesses tend to be in. So with that being said, if you can kind of look at this map, you can see that we can zoom in and look at specific counties. And so to make our lives easier, I'm going to go ahead and just type in Baltimore. And note that there's a Baltimore County in Maryland, and there's also a Baltimore City. In this case, we want Baltimore City, so I'm going to go ahead and choose that. And that's going to zoom into Baltimore, and it might take a second. But once that's done, we get a nice blue-looking map of Baltimore. And so just quickly breaking down what this map means, the lighter blue areas have in general lost less jobs, and the darker blue areas have in general lost total jobs. So the scale and the legend for this is in terms of total number of low-income jobs lost. So taking a quick look at this map, and I just want to preface this by saying I'm by no means an expert in Baltimore, and I in fact live in DC, it seems that a large part of southern Baltimore, near Locust Point and near the harbor, seems to be relatively well off, and other parts, northern and eastern parts of Baltimore, there are some neighborhoods that tend to be harder hit. So zooming in on this blue patch right here, it seems like right around the Frankfort neighborhood of Baltimore, excuse me, there are a good number of jobs lost. And so if I click on this particular tract, which is again just kind of a synonym for neighborhood, I'll get some additional information about the Frankfort neighborhood specifically. So here I see that in the US totally, there were 9 million jobs lost. In Baltimore City, Maryland, across the entire city, there are about 19,500 low-income jobs lost. And specifically in that one tract or neighborhood that I've selected on the map, there are about 200 jobs lost. And on the right here, it also breaks down how those 200 jobs are split across each of the different industries. So we can see here that most of the job losses tend to be in accommodation and food services, but also equally spread out among a couple of the other smaller industries like healthcare and social assistance, retail trade, transportation, warehousing, etc. So you can do this and you can zoom into your particular neighborhood and see exactly how hard your neighborhood has been hit. You can compare it to other parts of the city, and you can also see, breaking it down further, exactly which industries in your particular neighborhood have been hardly hit. The last kind of aspect of this tool that I think people will find useful is that you can also hover over specific categories and look at just that category's job loss on the map. So in this case, if I'm really interested in the workers that in the retail trade industry that lost their job, I'd simply click retail trade, and taking a look at the map, you'd see that blue's kind of shifted, and it seems that retail trade in general was a little more hard hit in Baltimore and across the city, again, other than really the southern part of the city. There seems to be a good amount of job loss in the retail trade. And zooming back into that neighborhood in Frankfurt, I get some more information about that neighborhood, but specific to the retail trade. So in the retail trade section across the United States, there are about 835,000 low-income jobs that were lost. In Baltimore specifically, there were around 2,000 low-income jobs that were lost, and in that particular tract, there were 24. And so similarly, I could go to any of these other industries and also get other industry-specific breakdowns. So if you work in one of these industries or do a lot of work with businesses in these industries, you can break down and kind of see exactly which neighborhoods are hardest hit. The last kind of caveat that I want to make is that this map and all of the data behind it is specific to where low-income workers live. It's not specific to where low-income workers work. So even though there may be a lot of, say, accommodation and food services and healthcare and social assistance jobs in downtown Baltimore or near the harbor, they're not going to be the areas lighting up in this map. The areas lighting up in this map are where workers who work in that area but live elsewhere. It's their neighborhoods that they live in that's going to be lighting up and becoming a darker blue. So again, this map is really meant for both community residents to better understand how their particular neighborhoods and the people who live in them have been affected, and also meant to help government agencies and nonprofit organizations understand where the people who have been most affected by COVID-19 or have been most likely to be laid off by COVID-19 are located, so that they can best allocate resources towards them. So I'm going to also just cover a couple of other quick things and then really open up the floor for questions. So one is that this map is useful and you can scroll again. You don't just have to go in Baltimore. You can kind of zoom out. You can look at other parts of Maryland to the north and south. And it seems like parts of Maryland to the northwest of Baltimore seem to be a little bit harder hit, and you can investigate those neighborhoods as well. But if you would also like the underlying data behind this, that's also downloadable at the bottom. If you go ahead and click on this link that says view the code, view the data on Urban's data catalog, you can click on it and get kind of CSV versions of these and play with it if you so wish. So with that being said, I'm actually going to stop and allow people to ask any questions if they have them, or if people want me to scroll to their particular neighborhood in Baltimore or even other neighborhoods across the United States, I'm happy to do so.
Thank you, Ajjit. There was just one thing I was going to ask, and then there's one question that's come up so far in the chat. Well, I'm sorry, not even a question, but just something that I wanted to point out. In Seema's presentation yesterday, she kind of showed how when we look at the map that Binya produces, how there are some disparities that are just communities next to each other. And so you interestingly brought up Frankfurt, which I believe next to that census tract is maybe, which is a little darker, it may be Parkside. Please don't hold me to census tracts rather than community, maybe rather than neighborhoods. And it may be just north east of that, Arcadia, but you can see that there's disparity, just communities right next to each other. And so very interesting to see that. It was pointed out yesterday and some other indicators that Seema had presented as well. And so just thought that that was interesting, that it really is no different. When we look at these maps, we constantly see the same indicators showing the same disparities in our neighborhoods, whether we're talking about small businesses, housing, or other things. So just wanted to, I'd say that I noticed that as well. But there's a question, how often is this map updated?
Yeah, that's a great question and something I actually forgot to cover. So we update this this map monthly using the latest BLS or Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers. So we first updated this in April. and we've since updated it monthly. And it's usually going to be around the first Thursday of every month, because that's when the BLS updates its numbers. So the next update from us is going to be somewhere around the first week of August.
Okay. And then another question is there any way to get the place of work from this data source?
So not from this particular data source. Here we kind of limited it to where workers live. But the underlying data that we used does also have place of work. And so if you're interested, I'd encourage you to reach out to me, and I think my contact details are in the page, but if not, my email is Narayanan, my last name, at urban.org. And I'd be happy to talk people through how to get that and how to analyze it themselves or use it themselves. But unfortunately, we don't have it mapped out in the same nice user-friendly way that this is.
Sure. Yeah, that would be something that'd be interesting to look at. Benya has a travel time to work map by neighborhoods. And so that'd be something interesting to look at based on where the places of work are. We can also look at how long it's taking folks to get there as well.
And that's actually one point I should have made a bigger point of, which is that oftentimes the biggest effects in the darkest blue tracks aren't in the city. They're usually in suburbs and places outside the city where people commute in to work, but oftentimes the layoffs, the places where people live aren't actually in the city. So it's often useful to kind of zoom out and get a sense of, what the surrounding census tracts and surrounding counties around that city look like as well.
Right, understood. And so the next question we have is, I know you're presenting mostly low income jobs, but is there a way to compare the middle and high income unemployment rates as well across these neighborhoods?
Yeah, so not currently in this particular iteration of the tool. That is something we have gotten more requests for and are trying to investigate in the future whether we could support that. This was really meant as like a quick data tool we could show to folks who were immediately responding to the effects of COVID-19. So when we initially built it, our focus was on low-income workers, but that piece of feedback is something that we're trying to incorporate in future revisions of this tool.
And then I'm going to ask another question kind of as a follow-up to this. I know this is presenting the number of jobs lost that are low income. Do you happen to have the number of jobs lost the net number at this point of jobs lost as a total?
Yes, and although I don't know it off the top of my head, if you scroll down to the data catalog, there is a particular CSV called, the IPUMS disemployment file. And so that's actually what we did there is we mapped these, job loss percentages and job loss numbers to individuals and the census microdata, and then added up across all jobs, low and middle and high income, how many there are. And I think, don't quote me on this, I believe that currently the total number of lost jobs across all low income, middle income, and high income workers is somewhere around 14 to 15 million. So again, the majority of the jobs lost are low income jobs, but there are also a good chunk of middle and high income jobs that were lost as well.
Okay. And then another question, how is low income classified, and what is the high end of that earning?
Yeah, so we have a little bit of better definitions down here, but low income jobs are defined as jobs with annual earnings below $40,000. And note that this particular data set also excludes certain kind of workers, such as independent contractors, those working in the gig economy. And it also doesn't say anything about jobs that maybe weren't completely laid off, but just reduced hours or pay cuts. This is just looking at the unemployment rate. So like people who actually were making under 40K, weren't working in the gig economy or as independent contractors, and were completely laid off. So in all likelihood, it's an undercount of the economic impact of COVID-19.
Great, that's very helpful. Well, thank you so much. If anyone has any additional questions, we'll also be taking some at the end of everyone's presentation. And Ajjit will be here until the end, so you can ask questions then if anything else comes up. So thank you again, Ajjit. That was extremely useful tool to present. I think that's going to be extremely helpful for neighborhoods in order to track some changes over the next couple of months. So our next panelist is James McComas. Mac is the Senior Program Manager for the 21st Century Cities at Johns Hopkins University. His research focuses on access to capital for small businesses and minority entrepreneurs.
Thanks. I'll just wait until the slide deck gets up there. There we go. So thanks for having me on today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that we started 3 years ago and have been contributing as one of the many indicators that gets reported on annually in PHINIA's vital signs. So you can go to the next slide. So back in 2017, we started to look into this question of how much money is going to small businesses in Baltimore City every year. And the reason we wanted to ask this question was because we were talking to people in charge of economic development policy in the city and the state, and nobody knew the answer. So we just started out saying, all right, we got to look at what is that number, and then dive deeper into some of these other questions here. What are the trends, the sources? And more recently, we started to look at the neighborhood level. So originally, our study back in 2017 looked at the city of Baltimore as a whole, and more recently, we've been interested in how those dynamics play out at the neighborhood level. And I'll just mention that at the city level, one of the things we noticed was that there were some concerning trends where Baltimore City had not recovered to its pre-recession or even early 2000s level of small business financing. And while this was a national trend, it was particularly pronounced in Baltimore. So we wanted to explore some of the reasons why that might have happened. So you can go to the next slide. So in starting out, just looking at some overall numbers on businesses and job growth in Baltimore, and I know Jay is going to address a little bit of this in his presentation later, so I hope I don't cover too much of what you're going to cover, but we sort of noticed this fundamental economic development problem in Baltimore, which is highlighted in this chart on the right hand of the screen there. And this is that, as Kristina started us out with at the session, saying that small businesses are the lifeblood of national and local economies. And while that's certainly true, and it's true nationally, and they've been driving job growth nationally, that's not the case in Baltimore City. So that red bar on the far right there is businesses with 500 or more employees. And they've, from 2010 to 2016, accounted for over 50% of the job growth in the city, while at the national level, that's more like 28%. So at the national level, what has been driving job growth, as I said, is small businesses. So they've accounted to around 45%, 44% of job growth, whereas in Baltimore, that's only around 33%. So we noticed this fundamental issue, and we didn't know why it was a problem, but we thought that access to capital was probably one of the driving forces behind this issue. So you can go to the next slide. So just an overview of some numbers in Baltimore. There are about 12,473 establishments and 39,609 non-employer businesses. So this is sole proprietors. And the vast majority of these businesses are what you would consider actually small businesses. And over the past decade or so, or since 2010, there's been very little growth in the number of establishments and in employment levels in the city. So again, we were noticing these concerning trends of a lack of growth in the number of businesses and the number of jobs, and we wanted to explore some possible correlates of access to capital for small businesses. One important thing that we noticed in looking at the data was that Baltimore is pretty special as far as cities go in their share of Black-owned businesses. So in Baltimore City, they make up around 46% of all businesses, and only around 9% of employer firms. But that's still one of the highest rates of Black-owned employer firms in any county in the United States. So then getting into sort of what is the mix of businesses in Baltimore, there's just a little chart here, but I'll say it's pretty comparable to what you're going to see around the US. It's a heavy focus on retail and professional services, food services, things like that. Manufacturing decline has been pronounced in the city, but also nationally as well. So you can go to the next slide. So going back to that first question we had of how much money is going to small businesses in Baltimore City every year, we found from 2010 to 2018, there was around 500 million to, in its most recent year, which was the most over that period, 820 million. Now, as you can see, we've broken it down by public and private sources, and the vast majority of this funding is coming from private sources in the form of banks and venture capital investments. And I'll just say here that one of the most common sources of financing for small businesses is family and friends, but from a research perspective, it's extremely difficult to quantify that, especially at a local level. And in terms of total dollar amounts, that's probably a much smaller figure than what you're going to see in terms of bank loans and venture capital investments. So we decided to really focus on what banks were lending in Baltimore City. And the reason we ignore venture capital investments is because they're really a small number of the total number of funds flowing to the city. So that 460 million, that's probably around 200 investment deals going to small businesses in the city of Baltimore. One of those was around $100 million. So these aren't your Main Street businesses. These are more like biotech and pharmaceutical research companies that are getting huge inflows of money, but probably aren't employing that many people. And we really wanted to tie this to job growth and local economic development. So you can go to the next slide. So again, why did we focus on private banks? One of the reasons we wanted to is because of the Community Reinvestment Act, a now 40-year-old piece of legislation that is supposed to ensure that banks that take in capital in the form of deposits, so the amount of money that you go and you put in M&T Bank or you deposit your paycheck in BB&T or SunTrust. The Community Reinvestment Act is supposed to ensure that banks that are taking in money from the communities are lending it out, especially in low and moderate income neighborhoods where they have branches and operate. So again, defining what counts as a small business loan in here, these are loans that are less than $1 million made by banks with over $1 billion in assets. So these are pretty sizable banks. I know $1 billion sounds like a lot, but when you're thinking in terms of a bank, that's going to capture most of the banks out there today. So who are these banks? You're going to recognize some of these names: American Express, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. There's also some regional banks like M&T Bank and PNC Bank, and local banks that really only do business in sort of the Baltimore metro area like Howard Bank and Columbia Bank. You can go to the next slide here. So this is just a map of the total dollar amount of small business loans going to Baltimore City census tracts from 2012 to 2017. And it's a little small, so if you can't see it, the light areas are getting less money and the dark areas are getting more money. So, the geography of this isn't going to be a big surprise to people that look at a lot of maps in Baltimore. This is very reflective of a lot of the disparities that we're going to see. So you can go to the next slide. And this is just the total number, which is basically the same. So one of the things we wanted to do was take some of this data and relate it to some common demographic data that was publicly available through the census and some other indicators on small businesses and look at, when controlling for the number of jobs in a census tract, where the money was flowing. So you can go to the next slide here. So we in particular wanted to look at how race and poverty are related to small business lending in the city. There have been a couple other studies looking at these similar measures in Chicago and Los Angeles. There was a study that came out a year or two ago that looked at some similar data in Baltimore with home mortgage lending and community investments. So we essentially found that race had a bigger effect than poverty had in terms of the disparities of where small business loans were going to. So controlling for the number of small business jobs in a census tract, we found that census tracts in Baltimore City that have populations that are fewer than 50% Black received 1.3 times more small business loans in terms of the total dollar amount than neighborhoods that are more than 85% Black. And the ratio of low poverty to high poverty was much smaller. In fact, low poverty neighborhoods received more funding in terms of small business lending than, high poverty neighborhoods received more than low poverty neighborhoods. And that was, a little bit puzzling to see. And again, I can't completely explain that phenomenon, but what became clear was that race at the neighborhood level was more correlated to small business lending events. So you can go to the next slide here. So this is a confusing looking table here, but the things that I really want to point out are what's circled in red here. And what we did is we did some tricky economist linear regressions, and we essentially wanted to look at the correlates of the amount of small business lending that was going to census tracts in Baltimore City, going to neighborhoods in Baltimore City, and relating that to some of these common demographic variables that you get that are discussed a lot. And we control for year and geography here. So anything that's generally outside of these observable characteristics is controlled for. And we found that while the number of small business jobs is significantly driving where the total dollar amount of small business lending is going in the city, the coefficient there you see is actually stronger and significantly negative for the percent Black that a neighborhood is in Baltimore City. So unlike the previous slide where we showed you sort of like different buckets of ranges of the percent Black that a neighborhood is in, this is saying that for every additional percent Black that a neighborhood is, you see a decline in the number of small business loans that are going to that neighborhood. And that's, we didn't find a similar correlation for education, for poverty, or for homeownership. You see some positives and negatives there, but none of those were statistically significant. So they have some effect, but we can't say that they're that strongly correlated there. So what I really wanted to highlight here is that, we don't know exactly what's going on, what's driving these dynamics, why there is this correlation, but we know it exists and it's certainly concerning. It probably opens more questions than it answers, but with this information, I think you can start to go and start to, poke holes at what's happening in Baltimore City in terms of economic development strategy and where funding is being driven in terms of banking and policy and incentives, and which neighborhoods are getting that money and which neighborhoods aren't. And in the interest of time, I'll open it up to questions.
Right on time, perfect. So I just, to start us off, have a question about the previous studies that you alluded to in Chicago and other cities. that did similar studies around these around small business lending. Did they show any other significant disparities around Black businesses to this extent that Baltimore is seeing, or any kind of disparities that were similar in some kind of nature that we could start kind of making some identifying some of similarities in these communities that we're seeing some issues that we can possibly start addressing together?
Yeah, so I'll say the other studies in Chicago and LA found similar disparities in terms of the sort of Black-white ratio, but they found a ratio for high poverty neighborhoods to low poverty neighborhoods that was more in line with what you'd expect. So they found that high poverty neighborhoods were receiving less funding and low poverty neighborhoods were receiving more funding, and we didn't find that in Baltimore City. And again, I don't know why that was, but I thought it was interesting. Yeah.
And then I know this was not something that you brought up, and forgive me if this is a question completely out of left field, but with the PPP program, which was supposed to be providing a lot of access to capital for small businesses, primarily, we saw that that was not how it actually worked out to be. But here in Baltimore, did you notice any trends with increased access to capital for small businesses, specifically around the local and regional banks that are in our area?
Yeah, so we haven't, this is something that we're beginning to look into, is doing a similar study at the zip code level using the PPP data. You know, what I'll say that was concerning that a lot of researchers and news reporters raised was that a lot of the distribution of PPP loans, a lot of what it relied on was previous banking relationships. And because what we saw in Baltimore City was this trend of historically weak and weakening banking relationships between businesses and banks, and a declining number of banks that are present in the local market, you know, we think that probably contributed to the ability of local businesses to access capital, because there were stories coming out early on of businesses that had pre-existing relationships through lending getting loans first.
And then one other question from me, and then I'll go to the chat. What are some of your recommendations for some of our local capital firms to begin supporting Black businesses, especially if poverty doesn't seem to be playing into, or communities that are hitting those poverty levels that you indicated is not the driver of why these businesses aren't being funded or seeking funding? Is there something else that capital firms should be doing to really start supporting these Black businesses?
Yeah.
In your opinion?
Yeah. So yeah, in my opinion, but also, you know, backed up by research, there's this notion that because everybody can bank on, or people with access to the internet can bank online, and online banking has grew, that sort of local relationships don't matter as much as they used to. But that's just simply not true. The relationship and sort of distance to your nearest bank branch really matters in your ability to access capital. So, you know, I'd say that small business lending especially is still a relationship-driven industry. So, you know, I think banks should certainly focus on trying to rebuild some of those relationships, especially given, you know, some of the historical concerns that have been around the lending relationships between small businesses and home mortgage lending in Baltimore City. But in terms of, you know, getting creative and financing some of these businesses, you know, banks have restrictions, especially after the 2008 recession, and what they can and can't do. They have restrictions on the amount of capital they have to keep in reserve, and the businesses that they're allowed to lend to in terms of what their credit score is like. But there are community development financial institutions out there, these sort of nonprofit lenders that are a little bit more flexible in terms of who they can lend to, and they generally have better relationships with local area businesses. So, and part of what you can do as a bank to meet your Community Reinvestment Act legislation requirement is to essentially give somebody's local community development financial institutions money to deploy locally. And again, they can be more flexible and probably better deploy capital to businesses that wouldn't be able to otherwise access. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I was typing and I thought it might be distracting. So a couple of questions. We have, is there a list of the large firms that you were referring to in your presentation?
Yeah, so it's a good question. The Baltimore Business Journal publishes lists of some of the largest employers. Again, that's in the metro area. As far as like a easily publicly available data set, there's not one that I'm aware of that you can get on sort of who the top employers in Baltimore City are, but please anyone jump in if they know of that list.
So I believe on the Baltimore Development Corporation's website, they keep a list of major employers, but those are typically much more than 500 employees, which I'm not sure if that's the small business indicator that you're using in terms of number of employees, but those are much larger. But beyond major employers, I'm not familiar with a consolidated list as well.
Yeah, but there's plenty of proprietary data out there that you can pay to get to lists, but in terms of what's publicly available, I'm not too sure.
Yeah, and then an additional question: does the map reflect the place where the business owner lives or the address of the business?
It's the address of the business, so it's the where the business establishment is located.
Okay, great. All right, and so again, if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to add them to the chat and we can get back to them after our next panelist presentation. So thank you, Mac. All right, and so our last panelist, but certainly not the least of them, Jay Nwachu. Jay leads the Innovation Works, which is a nonprofit social enterprise in Baltimore City committed to decreasing the city's racial wealth divide through the launch and growth of sustainable social enterprises focused on Baltimore's economically distressed neighborhoods. They also serves as president of Ignite Capital, a social impact fund subsidiary of Innovation Works dedicated to closing the access to capital gap for enterprises in the Innovation Works pipeline. Thanks, Jay.
Hey, thank you. It's not allowing me to share. Somebody can help me with that.
I can share for you if you'd like.
Cool. Okay. I'm gonna while I start talking, I'm gonna shoot you a quick email if you don't mind. I added a maps of the PPP loan distribution that I had access to mine really quickly, Mac, for the question that was asked earlier, so I can pick up on it later on, but no pressure at all. Yeah. So if you don't mind sharing, we can get started. All right, everyone. Good evening, and thanks again for the great introduction, Kristina, and for Mac and Ajjit for the presentation earlier. I'm going to talk a little bit about Innovation Works and the work that we do. Not much about Ignite Capital. I can talk more about that when we talk about access to capital later on, if there are any questions about that. But the focus of my presentation is really going to be around the COVID impact on small businesses in Baltimore, especially in the communities that Innovation Works is focused on. So there is a very limited scope because I want to make sure I stay in my lane while Mac and Ajjit kind of do their thing. It's funny watching your presentations. As a former math minor who now talks for a living, I almost missed some of that math a little bit and some of that stuff I saw, and I'm like, yeah, I'm glad I didn't do that anymore. I just talk now, which is cool. So just a little bit about Innovation Works. Next slide, please. Innovation Works, as already mentioned, is a nonprofit social enterprise in Baltimore And the few key things about our mission is what is highlighted in red. One is a focus on reducing Baltimore's neighborhood and racial wealth divide, because Baltimore is pretty unique in that way. We're a neighborhood by neighborhood city, and it's pretty clear when you look at the maps, every single map trend we look at, that there is an economic divide along those same neighborhood lines for the most part. And we are doing that through working with actual residents and small businesses in neighborhoods with the lens of social enterprises as a focus. For us, social enterprises speak to entrepreneurs that are looking to address specific challenges that are facing community members and residents, whether it's job creation, providing basic amenities in neighborhoods so you can have a more livable community, and in many other ways we think about that, but also thinking about having a more sustainable business model behind that, as opposed to a traditional nonprofit that is looking to address challenges, but focusing primarily on grants. We're really looking at entrepreneurial discipline along with social impact as a combined strategy to help do this, get the double bottom line that we want. And the ultimate goal is to help build more sustainable neighborhood economies. And what that looks like for us are neighborhoods where we honor the rich history and the people that are in those communities, help them build from within so they can have a sustainable neighborhood economy of their own that does not necessarily require as much outside influence, so that when we have traditional access issues to financing and banks, if they have a more sustainable economy locally, some of those issues might be subverted a bit. Over the next 10 years, we have this really crazy goal of helping to launch 250 such enterprises across these neighborhoods that we focus in, to employ 5,000 people and attract $100 million in capital and investments into businesses in these communities. This is year 2 of this big goal. And I can talk more about that if people have questions about that. All right, next slide, please. And when we look at our general strategy, and I say this because the lane I'm coming from is going to be limited to these particular areas. This is what I do every day. One is the neighborhood strategy. We identify specific neighborhoods and we partner with local partner organizations and residents in those communities to really talk about what the greatest opportunities are for businesses, for people to become social entrepreneurs, and try to bring resources, whether it's through Ignite Capital and access to financing or all the other social enterprise development tools that we have, to the neighborhoods. Because often what we have is folks say, we can support you with your small business, but you have to come to us, and we already have enough challenges in communities. We need to be able to take resources to people. The social enterprise development side is really a full out from idea to scale, I generally from frustration to scale pipeline development strategy that focuses on getting social entrepreneurs across the growth process of growing a company. When I say frustration, I mean I'm sitting on a stoop with 20 ideas running through my head. I just want to do something for my community. We can take you from there, or we can take an existing enterprise that really wants to reimagine how they are impacting their communities and also grow their business at the same time, and giving them the exact same amount of resources to be able to do just that. And strategic initiatives, sometimes try to think outside of one neighborhood and outside of one entrepreneur and think about sectors where we can bring ideas to the table to help grow new sectors in Baltimore. Right now, we're looking at things around urban wood, natural dye, to think about what jobs and what businesses can be created in those spaces, since we have great assets in Baltimore with those things. Those are the 3 general buckets that we operate within, and that sets the stage for what I'm going to share about how COVID has impacted small businesses, primarily from the lens of these communities that we work in. Next slide, please. Somebody's asked me to speak a little louder. Can you guys hear me well? Okay, all right. So small businesses, who are we talking about? Back to data again, right? So there's not gonna be a lot of numbers on my slides, but I do wanna point out a few things that we think about when we think about data. So the next slide, please. When we look at Baltimore and we look nationally, and Mac already went through some of this, so I'm not gonna belabor the point on some of these numbers. We already talked about 52% of businesses having less than 5 employees. This is coming from data from the BDC. And a lot of this data is also being fed down from national data. What I will say, and Mac already mentioned this, I think Ajjit already mentioned this as well, is that this data set is not gonna capture a lot of our solopreneurs out there, or independent consultants, gig economy workers. And a lot of those folks were the ones most impacted by COVID, because this is a core sources they're living in, they were already on the margins, and then not having access to the resources that were made available only made things more painful. 95% of the net new jobs between 2010 and 2017 were created by those employers with 500 employees or more, right? And we can say roughly 80-90% of the businesses in Baltimore really are on the other end. They don't have 500 employees. They have a whole lot less than 20 employees, but then 95% of the new jobs are created in those companies with 500 or more employees. That kind of gives you a vision of, okay, what type of jobs being created in Baltimore and who are getting those jobs, because it's certainly not in the neighborhoods that Jay is talking about, right? And then, for whatever crazy reason, I come from an HR background. There's this growing movement for freelance work and solopreneurs and gig economy workers and the shared economy that we're in. It scared me for a long time about how sustainable those types of jobs are, right? Because it's times like this in a crisis moment where we realize how vulnerable gig economy jobs are. And we've seen the impact of that as well. And then, we talked about minority-owned businesses in Baltimore, and actually in Baltimore, only 12% of the revenue of small businesses are captured by minority business owners, even though minority business owners have over 50% of the businesses in Baltimore, which are primarily going to be smaller businesses versus the 500 employees or more businesses. So I just want to call those things out, because when I talk about small business, we need to be very mindful what we mean by that. When the SBA says that a small business can be between 500 and 1,500 employees or less, when we say small business in Baltimore, that's a very different picture than what the SBA is saying. So when we look at what sources of data we are using to interpret and shift policy and think about how to make resources more available, we should be very mindful about this huge gap between the data that we get and of what's actually happening in communities that are not doing very well already. You can go to the next slide, please. So how COVID impacted Baltimore. Let me just talk through some trends and through this timeline of this, time warp we've been in since March, really. So early, it was, obviously non-essential business closure, the early talks of government dollars being put out there to help. The state came out first, federal government came afterwards, Baltimore City came on after that. And, there was the issue about, we got to get toilet paper. We got to do all this. It was a state of shock, right? And an immediate response was just basic life stuff, right? And as time went along, it was more, all right, get out of shock. How do we start responding to what's happening to us, especially in the business community? Since April, we've had a number of trends that have popped up. There's all the resource lists, right? Apply here and do this and do this. And some of the challenges there, somebody says, oh, there's a fund with the state, go apply. And 2 days later, oh, sorry, too many people applied. We shut it down already, right? We saw a lot of these things happening where lists were just being passed around. And within a week, the list was already outdated. The government responses were sometimes helpful, especially maybe at the state level. But we know all the challenges with PPP and all the other loan products that were out there with changing rules and people not really understanding what they were applying for. And if you don't have, once again, that good relationship with a bank, you're on your own, it speaks to your ability to actually use those resources. And then there's the early data coming out around unemployment. Once again, who's that data talking about and who's not being captured, something to be mindful of. And then eventually we got the responses from the philanthropic sector, the city government, and other companies that are doing more donations and things like that. Ultimately, I will say all those resources were great, but not enough to help people rebound. It's really more, can you pay your rent next month? It's, can you buy groceries tomorrow? I don't know that there are resources in place that are sustainable for the long term to help these small businesses that were already vulnerable get to a better place 6 months, a year from now. Now we're getting the data starting to pour in. The SBA released their early data on the PPP loans about 2 weeks ago on July 6th, right? And we can see the early distribution of where the resources went. But the challenge even with that is in the application for PPP, demographics data were not mandatory. So you can't even really tell, right, if the data is accurate or not. Now, to apply for forgiveness, it's going to be mandatory. So we almost have to wait another month or two to get the real data about really where the money went and where it didn't go. Next slide, please. Because then we start asking ourselves, what is the actual real story when we start looking at the specific profiles of small businesses that might not be captured in the broader data set. For This is now looking at the folks that we've been working with in our pipeline of entrepreneurs that we work with. We have roughly about 100 of them actively that we're supporting. And then through some other work that I'll talk about in a second about where some of this data is coming from. If you are the individual entrepreneur with no employees, the solopreneur in my world, one is, can I take on more debt to keep this thing going? And a lot of people are like, no, I'm not going to do that, right? When you have artists who had gigs and performances who had canceled contracts because there was nowhere to go perform, you don't get that money back, right? There are a lot of challenges there, lack of clarity on programs. People were like, I'm not even gonna bother applying because I gotta fill out all these forms to not know if I'm gonna get something. We got a lot of that in our responses. A lot of it was really focused on individual survival. Should I just go apply for unemployment and call it a day, right? Micro businesses, those with like 2-3 employees, neighborhood-based businesses, a lot of it is really more, do I lay people off so they can get unemployment, or do I go apply for this loan thing? And if I don't get forgiven because I don't understand the rules, will I have to owe money that I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay back? A lot of these questions we were helping people answer. And not having a small banking, the banking relationship certainly hurt a lot of people. And some folks just didn't have the capacity or the bandwidth to just do this stuff because they were just tired emotionally, right? Nonprofits were a little bit better. Some of them on a smaller end, fiscal sponsor issues. Can I apply? Can I not apply? But also trying to meet the needs of their communities and shifting service to virtual modes sometimes distracted them from the ability to survive as a nonprofit. And also thinking, I can only apply for grants. So who's doing emergency grant making, which is a whole nother problem in itself from an access to capital standpoint. And then the larger businesses, it was really more, maybe I have some money in the bank. Should I go take on more loan now, or should I just focus on pivoting my business to do better? This is some of the scenarios we were working through with people in solving these challenges over the last couple of months. Next slide, please. Some other observations, and then I'll talk about the map in a second, that we kind of just experienced. One is that if you are not part of an ecosystem, the support from whatever systems it came from were much less likely to get to you, right? So if you are in an artist community, there was an effort organized by the artist community led by good friend Maggie Villegas and a couple of other artists, and then brought the Maryland State's Arts Council to be able to do some small grants, right? Before them was Alana Nicole, who had her own one-person show raising money and just giving people grocery money here and there. But you only know those things if you're part of a community, of an entrepreneur community, right? A lot of our neighborhood businesses are in their neighborhoods. They're not part of the big ecosystems that we talk about in Baltimore. A lot of missed opportunity there for them to be able to get access to information quickly and technical assistance to be able to do what they needed to do to get resources. Once again, reports do not accurately reflect the challenges of communities in Baltimore, especially in that huge section of the map, the black butterfly, as we talk about, because they're not part of the data set for the most part, and it's unfortunate. What I appreciated was that there were many organic collaborations. People just trying to help, right? There were the folks who were just buying products from small businesses in Baltimore and selling them on their behalf to help just, I had the delivery come to my house with different products from different places. It was really cool to see that. There were other smaller nonprofits that were coming together to say, how do we support each other? We are a part of a small business support group with the BDC to think about how to get more information out through smaller ecosystems. A lot of those things happen, which also presents a great opportunity for us to say, moving forward, how do we better strengthen these groups to make sure that we actually have networks that can reach the depths of the neighborhoods, especially in the most vulnerable communities? And we were part of this small magic that happened with a bunch of local makers making face shields and face masks to be able to give first responders the opportunity before the nation's figured out its supply chain fallouts, right? So some good things happen. What I would love to see there is us actually appreciating the fact that we have a strong manufacturing base in Baltimore who can respond, who can actually produce things if given the opportunity. Because we think about those major corporations, once again, it's not just like access to capital issue, is where are they spending their own dollars? Where are they buying their trash can liners from? Where are they buying their paper from? Can we create jobs to do those things in Baltimore? I think the manufacturing community said, we made hand sanitizers, face shields, face masks. What else do you need? Give us, let's create some jobs and do some things here in Baltimore. There's a hunger for that, and we need to recognize. And lastly, trust building is still important. A lot of the challenges was really having 2-3 conversations with one person to even trust the system before they submit an application. That's crazy to me, right? the systems that are supposed to support the small business is saying, first of all, who are you? What am I filling out? What type of information do you want? And what will this information be used? And there's a lot of that still, a lot of that is still a challenge that we need to work through. It's just another observation that I wanted to point out. And then the last slide kind of talks about the PPP loan distribution, if you want to go there. Once again, not sure. Oh, sorry, you don't have it. But hey, here's a surprise. There's certain parts of the neighborhood where people don't get resources. It's the same exact places where the PPP loans didn't go. That's the surprise. So I'll stop there.
So did you still have a map that you wanted to show, or is that what you just referred to?
That was it.
Okay.
That was I just
right.
getting spoiler. Yep, that's it.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a running theme for a long time, is that the map doesn't change very much. So one question that we've received is, do you include worker-owned cooperatives in the umbrella of social enterprises that you listed?
Most definitely. I could explain more, but yes, resounding yes.
And then there's no surprise about the map. And I think there was one other question. I'm going back through the chat. Nope, I think Mac handled that. And so I did have a question. Of the scenarios you went through for solopreneurs, all the way up to small businesses, what tended to be their default response to what they needed to do when they were assessing the state of their business? If they had employees, was the default to just lay everyone off so that they could access the unemployment, especially since there was an incentive along with that this time around? Or were some of them accessing credit? Were they reaching out to their family and friends, those who have family and friends who have equity or some kind of wealth to actually lend? So just wondering what some of those defaults for businesses tended to be.
Yeah, and it also depends on the nature of the business, right? If you're a business with rent overhead, and we have a business that we're supporting, it's a clothing store, right? Social mission of hiring folks that we care about. Clothing store. You can't sell clothes because your store is just not essential at this point, right? It's essentially, how do we convince someone that unfortunately you're not essential right now, but trust me, we're always going to need clothes, so don't go out of business, right? How do we ride out this wave until you can reopen again? So it's really pivoting around, how do we help you go back and negotiate rent so you can get a deferral, so you don't have to worry about those cost burdens, apply for PPP, even though you only have 2 or 3 employees, it might be helpful, but then get like $3,000. It's like, what are you going to do with that, right? Mm-hmm. And then for some folks, it was, we already sell products. We can actually put more money into virtual marketing, online marketing right now, and just see how we can just get ahead of the market in this space. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to keep all your employees. Some folks, it was really laying off people. We had a business that thought about the 3 co-founders and say, if we lay off 2 and keep 1, we can save ourselves some money operationally and keep 1 person running the organization while 2 people go on unemployment. I mean, these are like nuanced decisions that were being made, especially in the small business community.
Yeah. And then there was a question about what communities or what neighborhoods do you focus in on?
So right now, the neighborhoods that we have the most active partnerships in, so our office is at OpenWorks, so Greenmount West, Johnston Square, that broader Greenmount Avenue corridor. Another is the Fayette Street Outreach Community right around Bon Secours Hospital on the west side. And then Sandtown, Harlem Park, kind of combined on the other side of the MARC station. And then the Hilton Street corridor on the other side of the Gwynns. So thinking, what is the cluster of neighborhoods that is just literally escaping right now? But the south, where Green Street Academy is, that corridor on that side. And we are just starting a budding relationship with McKeldrey Square on the east side. And I'm not going to mention the last one because it's still very early, but yeah, there you go.
Great. And then,
but I should say this. Those are neighborhoods where we're actually trying to do active work in thinking about the neighborhood. We also have this open pipeline system where entrepreneurs just come from everywhere, right? So we have this open system for social enterprises that is not tied to neighborhoods. And then we have the neighborhood strategy. My wildest dream is that entrepreneur over here says, I need to open up a building I say,
Mhm.
hey, come to this neighborhood. They would love to have you, right? Don't go downtown. We have enough downtown, right? That's how we think about it.
Okay, so then a quick follow-up from me is what kind of support do you then offer to those entrepreneurs and the
Yeah,
neighborhoods that
yeah,
can help make those transitions? I think from my perspective in working with businesses, the technical assistance, I think sometimes is a short-lived process. So it's never long enough for small
yeah.
businesses to actually get to a place where they're sustainable. And so I'm just wondering like how
Mhm.
your neighborhood strategy and the pipeline are working together to support both.
Yeah. So we try to put them in three core buckets of resources. One is technical assistance curriculum, right? So we are a strategic partner with the Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship out of Santa Clara University in California. And they have this, I don't know, amazing curriculum of just business discipline and social impact that they've done for the last 20 years. And we've just simply adapted that for Baltimore. So we have access to all of that, which is helpful. And then we have our executive mentor network in Baltimore with about 50 mentors who actually bridge the, the curriculum with the entrepreneurs and also just bring their own work and lived experiences and also allow the entrepreneurs to bring their own lived experiences to the table and just partner together for the community's sake. And then the last bucket is Ignite Capital, which is the access to capital. So we have it's a test fund for us, a $4 million fund to kind of invest over the next 6 to 8 years in low interest, very patient debt. Some as creative as we can get with equity like things, just to give people an opportunity to just use money without having to pay it back immediately, right? And some grants for pre-revenue companies that are still yet to launch, because that's where that family and friends part is usually missing. And it's the difference between being able to launch a business on good standing versus rushing to the marketplace without doing all your homework because you didn't have the early capital to get that done. So we're very mindful about that part too. And the reason why there's 5 stages is because the resources are catered to each stage based on where you are, and capital is catered to each stage. I'm not going to give somebody with a brand new idea $200,000, but if you are a business been around for 17 years and you need to grow and hire 20 more people, maybe you can get $200,000, and we try to think about it that way.
Right. Another question that just came up was, did you also see challenges with businesses not set up appropriately, which left them ineligible for certain funding opportunities?
Yeah.
In Highlandtown, I'm sorry, I just scrolled past it. In Highlandtown, we saw some of this, and it became a large challenge because of it, because it's about business education. How do we continue this education?
Yeah, I mean, that was such a huge issue, especially for a lot of the smaller businesses and the individuals that were doing just gig economy stuff. So when I talked about capacity to be able to like respond to some of the resources that were available, sometimes it was time, sometimes it was emotional energy and trust. Sometimes it's just I don't have time to build a budget for you because I don't keep a budget well for myself, right? And it's like this is not the time for me to go do those basic things. One of the biggest lessons for us internally at Innovation Works is that we've gone back to look at our stage 2 before you launch a business and saying, what are the core requirements we're going to have now, right? Let's help you open up a bank account, right? If we need to introduce you to our banker, we will, so you can start building that relationship now, right? Let's make sure these things are in place so that you can be as formal in your business as possible. And let's help you track these things over time. And actually, quite frankly, if you're going to borrow money from Ignite Capital, it's a requirement to have these things now, but we will help you build those things. We're not just going to say, go figure it out, then come borrow money. It might just be, here's a commitment. You can take a third of the money now, but in the next 3 months, if you come back with your books organized, you can add second. How do we use capital also as an incentive to help people build sustainable businesses? Is how we think about that.
That's great. Do you bring students at Green Street Academy into this learning and work? And I'm just going to expand on that a little bit. Youth in general, how are you guys working to encourage youth entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so Green Street Academy, so actually the church that operates in that same building was our original partner in that neighborhood. And the goal was to start with them and work our way into the school and then out into the community. Hit some bumps along the road. We never really got to the school part, and we're still trying to get our way back there. But for us, when it comes to youth, we partner a lot with Dent Education, and they have a youth enterprise program in the city. because for us, we see the young people, especially in the neighborhoods that we're talking about, as the future entrepreneurs of their own communities and the future workforces of the adult enterprises that are going to be launched, right? So they are a critical portion of the pipeline for what this looks like for us when we say we're going to 5,000 jobs in 10 years. Who are those people, right? It is the young people that are in their communities right now, so they can feel like they have a sense of ownership and they can contribute to their own community while also making a livable wage. So that's how we think about the youth equation, and we do that a lot right now through Dent Education.
And could you spell what you're saying, education?
Dent, D-E-N-T.
Dent
Yeah.
Education. Okay, great. Because I'm pretty sure folks are going to want to look that up.
Yeah, look up Dent. They're great folks.
Awesome. All right, and then let's see. So do you think that the gig economy is dead post-COVID, or will it be the first to come back? Or are some of the small businesses that we see closing around us temporary?
I'll let some other folks speak to that. Mac, I don't know if you ever thought about that. But I mean, my hope is that it helps control the pace of growth of the gig economy because I just don't know that the gig economy is how we help people build sustainable wages to have sustainable lives, right? I think it's a nice additive, but we've somehow found a way to spun this into a thing that is. I think it is still a critical part of the economy. The shared services economy is not going anywhere for a while because these things are here; they're not going anywhere. I just think we should be measured as to how sustainable they are, right? I've had big brother conversations with folks who are like, hey, you want to get married? You think that's going to help you get to the next part of life? Like, let's rethink what that looks like. I don't think it's going to stop it. I just think folks need to be very careful about the risks of what that looks like. You save more up front to prepare for the rainy day. It's real conversations to be had about that. And the businesses, a lot of them are going to close and not come back. But there's also opportunity for others to start afresh. And that's how we're looking at it. I just don't know what that looks like just yet.
Mac, did you have a?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree. I'll say generally what you see in after recessions is that trends that were existing before the recession get accelerated. So you especially saw this during the last recession with the rise in sort of automation and moving sort of more administrative tasks to more automated tasks. And what you might, so I think there's certainly going to be an acceleration of that. There's going to be some of that, again, sort of maybe shifting of those responsibilities. You saw obviously a huge rise in delivery services from both restaurants and grocery stores and all other types of businesses. And a lot of this relied on those sort of gig economy workers. So I think, I think if your businesses are always looking at how to cover risk, and this exposed some of that risk and how it could be covered by gig economy workers. So I think you might see an increasing trend of businesses shifting to that model and more relying on these companies, these apps that provide that service to them.
And so to kind of carry on with that a little bit, Ajjit, you mentioned that job loss came down in the last few months. Which sectors were those that we're starting to see come back right now?
So yeah, the sectors that we saw were really accommodation and food services, largely because hotels and people who worked with them were kind of the first to close and are now starting to come back. And they, and again, the data sets that we use don't really capture independent contractors and gig workers at all. So I can't really speak to how quickly they will be coming back. But in general, we saw that low-income workers were kind of the first workers to lose a job in the pandemic, and they're not necessarily the first workers to get their jobs back. And so I think that kind of claim also holds true for gig economy workers as well, and agree with all the other panelists that we need to be careful and sustainable about how the gig economy affects us and what that means for the long-term nature of economic growth. It's just not sustainable.
And then this question is for either Mac or Jay or both. Do you explain the difference between business credit and personal credit when talking about one who's accessing it and then the amount of credit that's being utilized?
I'll let Jay speak to that because he's got much more on the ground experience, but I can fill in with my high view opinion.
I don't know how traditional financial institutions are looking at credit. I mean, I can take a wild guess, personal credit, right? And this notion of business credit is something that people are looking at a lot more. I'm not sure how they're balancing decision-making based on those two things, to be quite frank with you. With Ignite Capital, I'm actually going through the process right now of onboarding Experian into our platform, because for us, looking at credit is not a way to say you don't get money. It is to say, how do we start helping you build a trend of credit worthiness, quote unquote, so that you can have access to more capital down the line outside of us. So with Experian, we're actually doing a blended model where we can look at both business credit and personal credit, because we think some people would say, well, I've never done a business before. I can have a business credit, but I have pretty good personal credit. Well, that's actually a good thing, right? Or the other way around. Hey, went through this life challenge. Personal credit is not so great, but I've been running this business and I'm doing well. That's a good thing. We shouldn't penalize somebody for that. So we're trying to figure out how to use the blended model for decision-making for our end, but really also not setting a criteria that says you have to meet a bar. It's really, this is where you're starting, but we have a relationship with you that we want to build over time. And part of that is assessing how you grow in these areas.
So to build on that, I'll say, a lot of what I've heard is that a significant amount of early stage entrepreneurs sometimes simply just don't know that there is a difference between personal credit and business credit. And they think that, I don't own an asset in the form of a house. So how am I going to be able to take out a bank loan or get any form of loan in the near future, just because they don't know that exists? So I don't know if you come across that a lot, Jay, but I've certainly heard that.
Yeah, for sure.
And so just to kind of go back to the personal credit, during this time, I wasn't thinking necessarily about maybe business loans, but people utilizing their credit cards a lot. And so wondering now when we're coming to, I guess, the other side, I don't even know where we are in this crisis. We're back on an upward trend for some things and starting to see downward trends on others. So just not quite sure where we exist in this moment. But I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for us to start advocating for, even with personal credit scores themselves, like understanding how impacted they're going to be for not just businesses, but people in general. What kind of work do we see being able to advocate for folks to not have that be so much of a barrier for people getting their businesses back online because they had to use their credit cards for a lot of things, just to kind of be able to walk away from the property that they were renting, just to close out some accounts or things like that. Just wondering what everyone's thoughts are on that, because that was something of my concern, is just to be able to survive, people are going to end up maxing out cards with no income to be able to make those payments, and it's going to prevent them from being able to open back up any kind of business moving forward.
There's a slippery slope here in my response. I'm going to try to be careful with my words, right? There are always going to be people who will lend money to someone with not so great credit. The cost of capital is just going to be much higher, right?
Right.
Higher the risk, higher the cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what good is it to a small business to go borrow $20,000 at 15% interest rate? How do you even put that money to work in a business that's already not doing so well, right? I think we have to be, we have to get really, really creative in how we think about capital, because the traditional systems of capital that we have generally have their markets already figured out and they know where they fit in. It's the person who we sense a lot of this with the COVID response, who are like, I will do whatever I can not to take on more debt because I'm tired of debt. We got a lot of that, right? And some folks are just like, forget it, I'm not even going there. Now, personal credit perhaps for their personal lives, but from a business standpoint, a lot of folks are like, nope, don't want any parts of more debt. which to some, like, this is very admirable. And then for some people, I'm like, okay, like one or two people, I'm like, no, maybe you should take it at a cheap capital cost because you need it to actually grow your business in a pandemic because it's a great opportunity for you. There's conversations to be had about how and when we use credit and debt. And I think there's more education that could happen while the financing institutions get more creative, whatever that looks like.
Whatever that looks like.
Whatever that looks like.
Mac, did you also want to respond?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to highlight something that Jay said during his presentation that I thought was really important. I mean, sorry if there's a cat meowing in the background. I think, yeah, one of the things that crises like this do is really expose a lot of the existing disparities. And what Jay said about businesses that are connected to these local ecosystems and businesses that aren't, I think you're going to see this disparity in how relationships, both in terms of your immediate family, in terms of family wealth, but also your connections in just terms of knowing other business owners, but also being connected to state and local government and nonprofit institutions. I think this is highlighted, and banks highlighted just how crucial that is. So I think it's highlighted the importance of the need to build back those institutions that, again, maybe we thought weren't important because we can all pick up a phone, or most of us can get on the internet, and we thought that, again, that these local environments didn't matter, but they really matter more than ever. And the support we're able to give each other matters more than ever. So I think it's really, the work is really going to be in strengthening those institutions so that when this happens again, and it's going to happen again in some form of another, we'll be more resilient the next time. So, people like Jay doing this work is the essential, necessary work. So thanks for doing this day in and day out.
No, sorry, if I can just, a point I want to make with that too, it's we should all just accept that a lot of the communities that, can you guys still hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. A lot of the communities that I'm talking about were already in economic distress, right? Some neighborhoods are going to take 2 steps backwards, and there will be systems in place to help get them to where they need to get to, right? Even in the maps of the PPP distribution loan, not only does it talk about where the loans went, it also talked about the average size of the loans, right? So we can see the disparity even in that. Some neighborhoods will take 2 steps backwards, and it might take them a little bit longer, but they will get back there. Some neighborhoods are taking 5 steps backwards, 10 steps backwards, and they were already not in a good place to begin with. Now, what does that really look like? We thought we needed creativity a year ago. We need extra creativity now, right? And it's not just answering the same questions we asked 10 years ago. It's asking completely different types of questions now, right? For new types of answers. And I think if we have to accept that in this moment, because if we simply do the basic things to just say, well, let's get past this one pandemic, we're going to find ourselves right back here again a year, 2 years from now.
Or 5 years ago when we had an opportunity to start really making some changes, and 5 years later we're in a worse situation now, when some of the systems we could have put in place would have really been helpful. And so there is 2 more questions that we're going to take, I believe. And so one is for Ajjit. Which stakeholders are typically using your map and data the most? Is it policymakers? And then how should community folks like Jay use it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're not exactly sure who is exactly using it. Like, it's published online, and our hope is that everyone who wants to can use it. We built the tool specifically one for a policymaker and nonprofit audience. So we want people who work in communities who are doing service provision, whether they work in government or whether they work in the nonprofit sector, to be able to look at this map and say, okay, I want to get a sense of where jobs are being lost and how I can best allocate aid to those jobs. So for folks on the ground, like Jay, who's doing great work growing businesses in different neighborhoods, I want them to look at the map of their particular neighborhoods, see how their neighborhoods have been affected, maybe even break it down by industry and see if there are any particular industries that where many jobs have been lost, that maybe extra support is needed, and think about how they might need to adjust their organizational strategy or their service provision strategy to better match those needs. So it's at the end of the day, we really just think of it as like a need targeting tool, and different organizations can use that data to better optimize the strategies that they employ.
Great. And then the person who had the last question, it seems like they've left the presentation. So didn't know if you guys had any last thoughts that you wanted to kind of highlight before we close out this session, which has been absolutely amazing.
I'm all good. Thank you for guiding us through a number of great questions.
Well, I mean, this has been absolutely awesome. A lot of great information, and extremely happy to see that that everyone is out here like really understanding what's happening here in the city, and how while Mac said we're unique in a way that is not great, it's also an opportunity for us to start thinking differently and creative, like Jay said, and tools like Ajjit's is going to be extremely helpful for communities that advocate for the things that they need in their communities when it comes to partnerships and jobs. So I'm extremely grateful for all three of you, and I'm happy for very happy for everyone who joined us at such a late hour. And so I'm going to turn it over to Seema to close it out. Also, there's a survey link in the chat. So if everyone can click on that before leaving the room, that would be extremely helpful.
I just wanted to thank you, Kristina, for your moderating mastery. You did an amazing job. And really, the tool that Ajjit, I think you might have made it on the fly. I don't know how you did it, but it's actually an amazing tool that's been being used nationally. So we're really grateful for you to jumping in here and talking to us here in Baltimore and showing us how to use it. And to Mac and Jay, you guys are doing the hard work on a daily basis, trying to make our neighborhoods better. So thanks so much for joining us here in this panel, and to everybody that attended. Day 2 of Baltimore Data Week. You guys are the conclusion to that. That's awesome. We got 3 more days to go. So hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow when we talk about the environment and climate. But thanks so much for rounding us out today.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.